Imagine standing in a Roman palace on a spring morning in 218 AD. Sunlight streams through marble columns. Senators gather in gilded halls filled with exotic wines and delicacies from across the empire. And at the center of it all sits a young emperor, barely 18 years old, still arrogant, still defiant, still making choices that will doom an empire. He lifts his favorite cup, filled with wine from Syria, that strange fermented drink that Roman nobles craved above almost any other beverage. His advisors have cautioned him repeatedly, don't trust it. The source is questionable. But Elagabalus has never been one to heed anyone's counsel but his own. He's ruled for 4 years through sheer audacity, deposing rival claimants, surviving multiple conspiracies, and holding together power through shocking excess. What could a cup of wine possibly do to someone who survived all that? Within days, the most controversial ruler in Roman history will be writhing in torment, his body shaking with violent spasms. Within 9 days, he'll be dead. And within hours, his corpse will become so reviled that it will literally be dragged through the streets of Rome. His mutilated body thrown into the Tiber River, refused burial, denied any dignity in death. But here's what makes this death truly chilling. It wasn't the wine that killed him. Modern historical analysis has revealed something far more calculated. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about one of Rome's most controversial moments. You're about to witness the complete destruction of an emperor, all because of 9 days of paranoia, betrayal, and what might have been the most orchestrated assassination in Roman history. This isn't just about how an emperor died. It's about how his death was carefully planned by his own grandmother, who would replace him with her other grandson and erase him from history. All because of what happened in those final chaotic hours when Elagabalus realized too late that everyone around him wanted him dead. Or did he realize? The guards who were supposed to protect him, who heard his final screams, were the very ones who struck him down. Let me take you inside that palace, into the throne room, where Rome's fate was decided not by legions or law, but by the calculated murder of a young emperor whose reign had become too scandalous for Rome to tolerate. The last week of Elagabalus's life began, like so many others, with excess. March 3rd, 218 AD, and the young emperor had just finished another lavish banquet celebrating the Syrian sun god. At 18, he was shockingly young by imperial standards. But Elagabalus had always been different. While previous emperors like Marcus Aurelius and Trajan had been warriors and philosophers, Elagabalus was the priest, the provocateur, the one they called the Syrian. He'd scandalized Rome completely, and not by accident. Previous emperors had maintained Roman dignity, wearing the purple with gravitas. This hunting accident that conveniently elevated him to power just months after he arrived in Rome. His cousin Alexander was being groomed by their grandmother, Julia Maesa, who realized her first choice had been a catastrophic mistake. That evening at the palace, Elagabalus presided over another feast. The banquet was typical for imperial excess. Roasted peacocks, elaborate desserts, endless wine. But Elagabalus's attention focused on something else, his cousin Alexander, now Caesar, positioned as heir apparent. These weren't ordinary politics. Alexander represented the ultimate threat, so beloved by the Praetorian Guard that later historians would use him to condemn Elagabalus by comparison. The court advisors had explicitly told Elagabalus to accept the arrangement, explaining that his position was becoming untenable without a designated successor. Elagabalus knew all this. He'd been warned multiple times. The last time he tried to remove Alexander as Caesar, he'd faced a revolt. But on this March night, the emperor decided he could still outmaneuver his grandmother. He began plotting to eliminate Alexander from succession. Within days, everything unraveled. The chronicler Cassius Dio, writing decades later, described what happened with damning precision. This decision brought on a catastrophic response and violently provoked the Praetorian Guard, producing deadly rage among soldiers and a sudden and extreme conspiracy. The emperor's support collapsed. His allies abandoned him one by one. Soldiers who once cheered him now whispered mutiny. Then came the confrontation, the Praetorian Guard openly refusing orders, commanders threatening violence if he didn't abdicate in favor of Alexander. What's remarkable is how fast it happened. Elagabalus had hosted banquets as the supreme ruler of Rome. Within a week, he could barely leave his chambers without fearing assassination. The next morning, March 4th, any hope that this was just another political challenge evaporated. Elagabalus couldn't trust anyone. The guards refused to obey. More concerning were the messages arriving. Senators who'd once flattered him now sent nothing, as if he'd already ceased to exist. Word spread quickly through Rome that the emperor was finished. Messengers carry news to every corner, summoning the great families of the Senate. Most importantly, Julia Maesa sent instructions to the Praetorian Guard. She wasn't just any grandmother. She'd been the power behind two emperors and was about to engineer the transition to a third. If Elagabalus was going to be removed, it would be Julia's decision. But here's where things get brutal. As guards began gathering at the palace, they found an emperor who seemed to realize too late what was happening. One moment, Elagabalus would be the defiant ruler they'd known, ordering arrests and executions. The next, he'd be pleading desperately, offering bribes and promises, begging for mercy from men who'd already decided his fate. The conspiracy was complete. We know now from historical sources that Elagabalus faced a coordinated assassination plot, one of the most efficient political murders in Roman history. It involved his grandmother, the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, and even his own mother. They'd all concluded that Elagabalus was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too offensive to Roman traditions. The Syrian priest-emperor had to die. By March 6th, the sixth day of crisis, Elagabalus' situation had deteriorated dramatically. The Praetorian Guard was openly hostile. His advisors had fled. Most disturbing of all, his own mother Julia Maesa was being urged to abandon her son and save herself. The political machinery had triggered complete institutional collapse, where every power structure turned against him simultaneously. March 11th arrived, the ninth day, and Elagabalus made his final attempt to assert authority. He summoned the Praetorian Guard, planning to address them directly, to remind them of their oaths, perhaps to offer them whatever they wanted. It was a desperate gamble, though historians would never reveal what promises the emperor tried to make in those final moments. Given that Elagabalus had offended every Roman tradition, married and divorced 5 times, including allegedly to a male athlete, and tried to make the Syrian sun god supreme over Jupiter, there was probably quite a lot he needed to justify. On the morning of March 12th, Elagabalus entered the Praetorian camp. He spoke frantically, trying to win them back, explaining that he'd make Alexander sole heir, that he'd reform, that Rome could trust him. Then around midday, the Praetorian Guard struck. The chronicles noted with their love of symbolism that he died alongside his mother, Julia Maesa, both killed by the very soldiers who were supposed to protect them. About 100 soldiers participated directly, though thousands stood by watching. When the killing began, the screaming could be heard across the barracks. But if Elagabalus thought death would end his humiliation, he was catastrophically wrong. What happened to his corpse over the next hours was so degrading, so deliberately vicious that Roman historians wrote about it with grim satisfaction. The first atrocity was dragging the bodies through Rome. The emperor and his mother were stripped naked, their corpses tied to horses. Without any dignity, the bodies would decompose publicly, but they couldn't just dispose of them normally. That would be too merciful. So they decided to desecrate the emperor right there in the streets of Rome. The procedure was pure hatred. First, they dragged both bodies through every major street, letting citizens spit on them, throw waste, mutilate them further. Then came the ultimate insult. They attempted to throw the bodies into the main sewer, the Cloaca Maxima. When the corpse was too large to fit through the grating, they hacked it to pieces. Finally, they threw what remained into the Tiber River. No burial, no funeral rites, no recognition of his imperial status whatsoever. It wasn't enough. Not even close. The damnatio memoriae decreed against Elagabalus was among the most thorough in Roman history. According to Cassius Dio, his name was chiseled from every inscription, his face scraped from every coin, every statue melted down or recarved. The The historian noted with obvious approval that this hated emperor was erased from Rome as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. By the time they disposed of Elagabalus's corpse in the Tiber, pieces of him were already washing downstream. The current was swift that spring day, carrying away any trace of the young emperor. Even his bones would eventually dissolve, scattered across the riverbed, never to be recovered or honored. The corpse that had been an emperor just hours before was now just meat and bone being devoured by river creatures. Meanwhile, in Rome, Alexander Severus was being acclaimed as the new emperor with lightning speed. He'd been at the palace when the assassination happened. Instead of mourning his cousin, instead of showing any hesitation, Alexander immediately accepted the purple from the Praetorian Guard. He had every advantage. Julia Maesa, their grandmother, had orchestrated everything. His mother Julia Maesa was positioning herself as the power behind the throne. And most of the Senate and army, who'd been horrified by Elagabalus, welcomed Alexander enthusiastically. Alexander was proclaimed emperor by March 13th, just one day after Elagabalus's murder. The citizens of Rome, who had their own reasons for hating Elagabalus as emperor, celebrated in the streets. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, who happened to be the most powerful woman in the empire, immediately consolidated control around Alexander. So did the Praetorian prefect, who controlled the entire military as commander of Rome's elite troops. Here's the calculated part. Alexander claimed that Elagabalus had been a mad tyrant whose removal was necessary to save Rome. His evidence? The shocking behavior everyone had witnessed for 4 years. There was just one problem. Much of what we know about Elagabalus's behavior comes from sources written by his enemies after his death. The worst stories might be exaggerated or fabricated. But with the victim floating in pieces down the Tiber, who could prove otherwise? On March 13, 222 AD, just one day after Elagabalus's assassination, and while pieces of his body were still washing up on riverbanks, Alexander Severus was formally recognized as Emperor of Rome by the Senate. The Senate performed the proclamation even though they'd initially supported Elagabalus. Their justification. If Elagabalus had really been insane, then removing him was justified. When Elagabalus's remains finally settled somewhere in the Tiber's mud, it was Alexander himself who forbade any recovery or burial. In a brilliant piece of political messaging, the new emperor declared that Elagabalus was unworthy of Roman earth, showing condemnation of perversion while simultaneously asserting his legitimacy as the savior of traditional values. The aftermath of the assassination was transformative. They removed every trace of Elagabalus where possible because the roads of history were too rough for his memory. Even recorded in official annals with the worst possible interpretation. The smell was of corruption. Historians report that references to Elagabalus were rewritten, not in respect, but because his very name made Roman dignity seem violated. On March 15, 222 AD, just 3 days after his murder, there was no funeral for Elagabalus. No ceremony. Alexander made sure of that. But several historians noted that the Senate conducted Thanksgiving rituals because Rome had been delivered from tyranny. Elagabalus had tried to transform Rome's religion, to make the sun god Elagabalus supreme, to build the grandest temple. One of the most provocative religious reforms Rome had seen. The temple was enormous, a magnificent structure that proclaimed Eastern influence over Roman tradition. He'd specified that priests should serve this foreign god above all others. He had envisioned lying there forever, his legacy secured through religious transformation. Instead, his reforms were reversed immediately. The Senate desperate to erase his religious innovations as quickly as possible. The young man who'd ruled Rome for 4 years, who'd challenged every social norm, who tried to revolutionize Roman religion, and whose shocking lifestyle became legendary. That emperor was erased from memory, like a contagious disease. The historical mystery of what Elagabalus really did has never been fully resolved. For 1800 years, historians accepted the hostile accounts at face value. It made sense in a Roman context. An emperor dying from degeneracy, offending the gods, paying the price for his excess. It was basically a morality tale. But in recent decades, scholars published more nuanced analyses. They examined all the ancient accounts of Elagabalus's behavior, the shocking marriages, the the religious innovations, the alleged sexual scandals, the rapid downfall. They compared these to every other emperor who'd been condemned in Roman sources, every young ruler who'd threatened traditional power structures. Their conclusion was revealing. The sources are heavily biased by political enemies who needed to justify assassination and damnatio memoriae. Elagabalus was probably unconventional and provocative, possibly exploring gender identity in ways Rome couldn't accept. In ancient Rome, controlling the narrative was everything, with historical accounts written by victors who needed moral justification. The shocking stories about Elagabalus were perfect for explaining why he had to die. The sensational, perverse tales made it easier to accept that assassination was justified, that erasing him from history was necessary. Alexander Severus's reign lasted 13 years before he too was murdered by his own troops. Julia Maesa, the grandmother who'd orchestrated everything, died soon after. The empire continued its slow decline as military strongmen seized power repeatedly. Traditional institutions crumbled, and Rome entered the crisis of the 3rd century. The historians wrote that during these years, the empire nearly collapsed. The political instability only worsened when barbarian invasions accelerated and economic chaos spread, leading to 50 years of civil war that nearly destroyed Rome. When order was finally restored by Diocletian in 284 AD, the empire had been fundamentally transformed forever. All of this, the political murders, the institutional breakdown, the collapse of Severan dynasty stability, all of it traces back to those 9 days in a Roman palace when a grandmother decided her grandson was too scandalous to live. Or perhaps he really was as bad as the sources claim, but the truth died with him in the Tiber. Today, nobody knows where Elagabalus is buried. The Tiber carried his remains away nearly 2,000 years ago. The riverbed might contain fragments of one of Rome's most controversial emperors, or his bones were consumed by scavengers centuries ago. Modern archaeological surveys have found nothing. The river that flows through Rome still carries the secret of what happened to those scattered remains. Elagabalus thus spent his brief reign challenging systems of tradition that would outlast him by centuries. The Roman Empire still existed. The religious institutions he tried to change remained fundamentally Roman. The social norms he violated became even more rigidly enforced after his death. But his own body, his own grave, gone, vanished as thoroughly as the reputation he might have deserved. The emperor who challenged Rome for 4 years, who tried to revolutionize religion and society in the most sophisticated empire in the ancient world, who dared so desperately to be himself despite forced conformity and careful tradition, that emperor couldn't even control how history would remember him. He became in death exactly what he tried to avoid in life: powerless, condemned, and ultimately erased.